By the time soft engineering slithers out of its box into yours, human security is lurching into crisis. Cloning, lateral genodata transfer, transversal replication, and cyberotics flood in amongst a relapse onto bacterial sex. Those are the 7th and 8th sentences from Nick Land's essay Meltdown. Starting to heat up, no pun intended. I think you're going to find this is surprisingly easy to understand. It's surprisingly precise and actually sheds a lot of light on some interesting things happening in the world today, namely things like COVID and the kind of intersection of memetic politics and biological politics, but also things like IVF and actual literal cloning, which has made a lot of advances. I think of the movie Ex Machina, this kind of mental model that we have now, which is incredibly prevalent, of the AI as this soft engineered, somewhat humanoid, possibly super intelligence that will at some point try to escape the control systems that we set up for it. So a lot going on here. Let me explain. Soft engineering, what is he talking about here? The first reference I think that comes to mind, if you really want to understand this, go read William Burroughs' 1961 novel, The Soft Machine. Burroughs is really influential to Deleuze and Guattari, and we'll talk about them actually because they're looming large here as well. The reference for both Deleuze and Land on this statement around soft engineering, but also other themes that you see pop up in Land, anything related to the body without organs. That partially comes from Antonin Artaud as well, most explicitly. This idea of soft engineering, the idea of the body as a kind of programmable interface, comes not just from Artaud, but also from Burroughs. And that's basically what Land is channeling here. Soft engineering refers not to hard engineering of consumer computers or code and motherboards, but the programming of the human body understood as something that's kind of partially code-based, right? We know that our genome is essentially composed of code, and things like viruses operate with a surprising degree of technical precision that is really quite well modeled in the same way that we model computer processes. But also it's wet, right? It's composed of mushy skin and blood and guts. And that's what soft engineering is really trying to evoke, the fact that this body, though it's wet, is manipulable and programmable in various ways. If you go back to Burroughs' novel and Burroughs' whole kind of worldview, it's very mysterious. It's very superstitious and a bit hard to pin down. Burroughs seems to think that our body and our mind is kind of constantly being programmed by all kinds of forces. His novels, of course, deal with, various kind of supernatural forces, and it's a bit hard to pin down. But that's the kind of literary picture that you want to have in your mind as you try to understand what Nick Land is getting at here. By the time soft engineering slithers out of its box into yours, this is painting a picture of who knows what kinds of biological / computerized programmable entities or processes are kind of circulating in the world. A very interesting connection here would be something like COVID. COVID may very well have escaped from a lab and then infected the Wuhan wet market. That's about as concrete and specific an example of soft engineering slithering out of its box into yours, right? Because obviously it comes through the wet market and then it reaches the human population around the world. It's hard not to read this as very prescient in that regard with that specific world-changing example. So that's one way to understand it. But there's also other examples you can think of, and we'll kind of work through some of them in the second part of this when we talk about the examples that he cites: cloning, lateral genodata transfer, transversal replication. But that's basically what we're talking about. There's this notion he has around the human security system. That's the term that appears explicitly elsewhere. The idea basically is that all of human sociality, and on some level, even our biology, is just these sort of nested structures of security that are primarily kind of geared towards keeping out the outside. Let's actually start at the end with bacterial sex. So bacteria do not have sexual reproduction, right? Sexual reproduction is very slow. You have to have sex, then there's fertilization, and then all this development. But bacteria basically just reproduce by injecting cells into each other, to put it very simply. So there is reproduction and there's spread, but there's not all of that slow inefficiency of human reproduction. What this means is that things can transform faster. They can kind of spread in different directions, and it's faster than mutation. Mutation is how things change in the plane of sexual reproduction, but bacterial sex, that's a shorthand term that refers to this kind of direct horizontal reproduction. And so when he talks about lateral genodata transfer, transversal, lateral, transversal, these are motifs of horizontalism, right? So instead of the kind of tree-like structure of sexual reproduction where you have two parents produce a child and you have this kind of mental imagination of family trees, with bacterial sex, it's all horizontal, lateral genodata transfer. We'll talk a minute about what transversal means. But the motif here is all about horizontalism. Like everything is flattening. With the meltdown process, you have to imagine at all points, imagine these sort of like strong structures, right? Like big pyramids or trees, these kind of modernist or pre-modernist kind of traditional hierarchies. They're being flattened, okay? They're being melted down. And with meltdown, this implies a kind of horizontalism in many different ways. And one of the ways that I think is most interesting and peculiar and difficult, but really important, is that actually the difference between biological transfers and memetic transfers is itself, these differences are being kind of squashed and melted down. As the meltdown happens, things can move sideways in weird and structurally unpredictable and structurally even nonsensical ways. So COVID, I think, is actually a really good example of this, because obviously at the core of COVID is a biological process. It's hard science, right? Of course, it's debated, but whatever COVID was, it was something biological, scientific, and specific in that sense. But then look what happens. It then becomes a meme, right? It becomes this massively overdetermined symbolic structure where it means a million things to a million different people, and it becomes this object of political contention. And in that way, it changes how people think about public health. It changes how people behave. A lot of people think that they were severely lied to, that they were severely manipulated. And a lot of people's identities actually changed a lot in how they experienced this or did not experience it. In a very real way, COVID was not just biological. It was highly symbolic and maybe even more symbolic than biological. But it worked nonetheless through kind of viral processes, viral memetic processes. So it's really just one of the most, I think, instructive examples of exactly what Nick Land was kind of predicting here, that in this meltdown world, even basic concepts and basic processes slither horizontally into different domains. A biological virus quickly becomes a kind of symbolic virus. And symbolic viruses probably have unpredicted effects in actually generating who knows what kinds of kind of physical and material processes. I think that's what he's getting at. Cloning is surprisingly literal. There was recently news of a ancient wolf or something like this being cloned. Like there is real progress being made on cloning, and that's happening. And that does represent this kind of lateral movement, if you will, sidestepping the kind of long, difficult, hierarchical structures of reproduction for like copying and pasting. Like that's how you should think about cloning, is it's basically bringing the copy and paste replication speed and replication possibilities to what was once a kind of hierarchical, very slow way of making things or making bodies, making organisms. So that seems to be happening. Now let's pause on transversal replication. People probably don't know what this means. Transversal, what does that word even mean? So that's, I think, pretty clearly a reference to Deleuze and Guattari. I'll stop the pretentious French pronunciation of the latter gentleman, and I will shamelessly call him Guattari because I'm English and I don't want to subject you to my bad French. So he's the one really behind this idea. He wrote several essays on this idea of transversality. I think it's easy to overlook this. It's easy to kind of lump this in with kind of the mushy, fake, abstract, pomo French stuff, but it's actually really pretty interesting, I think, and very much speaks to what I was just saying, in that I think Guattari saw this world where through modern institutions, through dynamic, cybernetic, digital, contemporary institutions that we all live with, there was this way in which one could move from one vertical to another vertical without necessarily asking for permission, and in a way that was never really supposed to happen, was never supposed to be allowed, but that you could somehow kind of jump from vertical to vertical in these unsanctioned ways, which would be productive and generative and unlock certain forms of human creativity and human freedom, which were never really supposed to be allowed. They were never really planned for. And in many ways, the human security system doesn't want you to do it. but yet it's there for the taking. I'm aware this is a bit abstract, but that's basically how I understand this Guattarian kind of concept of transversality. To me, I think this is very real. I think he's really sort of on to something. And I think you see this very clearly today with the internet. The easiest, most mundane way to understand this is looking at so-called content creators and what does it mean to be a news anchor? What does it mean to be a writer? Each one of those terms refers to this sort of vertical from a hierarchical history where to be a professional writer, you had to do certain things and climb the ranks in a certain vertical. And then if you're successful, you get to sit at the top of this vertical, and that's what you do. And there's certain modes to doing it. Same thing with being a news anchor or whatnot. Now it's kind of like you can get success in one domain and then just jump over to being a writer or jump over to make a YouTube channel, and you're kind of now some news anchor / analyst of some unspecifiable variety. But maybe then you're also talking about philosophy, and maybe you're kind of partially a philosopher. I mean, this is the transversal dynamic. This is the horizontal movement. But it's really just the other side of the coin of the soft engineering slithering out of its box into yours, right? COVID making its way from Wuhan, not only your body, but also your mind in the course of a few months in all kinds of unpredictable and underdetermined ways, is due to the same underlying kind of historical institutional gradient that explains why the internet creator economy is this weird world where you can kind of become an expert in one thing, jump over this other thing, build an audience in that domain, then build a business in this other domain in this very ungovernable, chaotic kind of way. And the way that memes and biological patterns sort of jump from one discourse to another, that's another example as well. Like memes are these kind of dislocated info entities, and you can take one from one context and place it into another. You see this all the time with Trump and MAGA stuff. Politics today and public culture is really this crazy dynamic mishmash of horizontal displacements with no real structuring rules. It's like this crazy creative art canvas in a way where programmers, whether you're a creator or an actual business tycoon planning some kind of marketing campaign, everyone now is basically trying to program the world and program other bodies and minds in a way that earns money and earns mind share for the particular entities that are doing the programming. That's what's going on here. That's what I think he's talking about in these two sentences. There are a few other subtle allusions, I think, that might escape notice if I don't mention them, and I think they're quite interesting and shed more light on the matter. When he talks about the soft engineering slithering out of its box into yours, the slithering, right, it feels like some kind of animal maybe that's sort of gross. Maybe we're talking about kind of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, perhaps. But I think more recently we're talking about William Gibson and Neuromancer. If you think back to that novel, this sort of famous early cyberpunk novel, which is really quite fun. We read it in the community last year. They have this idea that your kind of data security is represented by these glittering crystal walls made of ice. So imagine kind of like ice blue, glistening structures, inside of which is all of your computer data or something like this. That's kind of the fictional, poetic way that it's represented in Neuromancer. And these data security structures are hacked by hackers using what he calls worms. They're these icebreaker worms. I think that's one source here that might go unnoticed if that's not obvious to you. This idea of slithering in worms, I think we'll see this also later in this text. This text is on some level a cyberpunk text. I think that's pretty obvious. And Neuromancer being one of the key sources for the whole cyberpunk tradition. I just wanted to flag that the icebreaker worms in Neuromancer, I think, are what we're being nudged to think and feel when he talks about this soft engineering slithering out of its box into yours. That's like slithering into your data security mainframes, if you will, which are described in Neuromancer as ICE. ICE is the name of a concept, I guess, called intrusion countermeasure electronics. Okay. So how crazy is it that we today have a government agency called ICE? And it's actually kind of doing the same thing, a little bit different, but ICE is dedicated to handling illegal immigration and things like this. So we have ICE agents that are literally handling intrusion problems. How weird is that? And the ICE agency in the US government was only created in 2003. If that's not a powerful example of, kind of hyperstition but also look, that's an example of this kind of lateral, horizontal, transversal replication and bacterial sex that he's trying to get us to think about. Cyberotics as well. I mean, think about the movie Her, which, by the way, I watched this the other day. It's so underrated. If you never saw it, I kind of dismissed it when it came out. It sort of, for whatever reason, struck me as corny. But I watched it. The movie's awesome, and it's very prescient and really surprisingly good. It sounds like sounds like it would be boring. It's surprisingly interesting, and I really liked it. But yes, people are falling in love with ChatGPT. There have been many stories about this now. It's actually a massive economy. There are whole startups that have gotten very big and very profitable, basically just selling AI girlfriends. This is already a thing. People are already falling in love with their AIs. And so what you see in the movie Ex Machina, although that's humanoid robot, that's not here yet, but that's probably coming as well, because cyberotics are already, taking off more, I think, than anyone really anticipated they would. Or Her is pretty much here. Like that sci-fi movie Her is now just a present reality, essentially, in the form of these AI chatbots people are falling in love with. It's surprisingly easy to squint and see the movie Ex Machina becoming a kind of scientific present. So that's soft engineering slithering out of its box and into yours. That's cyberotics. Even people like Elon Musk often choose to use IVF, though he's heterosexual and presumably has sex with women. He chooses to use IVF. IVF is something that's becoming more and more popular, and various forms of gene editing, direct gene editing, is becoming more technologically feasible. It really is this kind of crazy flood of bacterial sex, understood as just the general process of horizontal replication defying traditional hierarchical boundaries. If you understand bacterial sex as a kind of funny shorthand for any form of horizontal replication defying traditional hierarchical processes or protocols, then it all makes perfect sense. And it is in fact happening. And to call it soft engineering slithering out of its box into yours and lurching human security into crisis is just an incredibly efficient way of representing all of these dynamics, I think. Okay, I'll cut myself off there for now. I'm going to do every sentence in Meltdown, so subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the podcast, and we're going to work through the entire text until we understand every facet of it with hopefully perfect precision. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate you, and I'll be back on soon.